So today we will basically be discussing the idea, or several ideas, in particular poverty and its relationship with inequality, and as you see in parentheses, the lack of social mobility in many places in the world. So I want to start with a discussion, and I'm gonna stop sharing the screen regarding this question: why are people poor? So we have been discussing about why people are poor or why countries are poor. But now, let's try to define when we have poverty, what is poverty? And essentially, poverty could have many definitions. I try to narrow it down to a couple of things. So, in general, it implies that a person or a family or doesn't have sufficient resources, sufficient possibilities to essentially have a decent life, to basically have the different things that you require to have a decent life. And as Axel and others were discussing previously, this implies different dimensions and different things. Income and wealth, like having sufficient money or to buy things, buy the things you need, but also the kinds of services that that you receive or that you have access to, that your basic necessities are covered, health, a security, as you were mentioning, and in general that you can actually have social and human rights, because even if they are placed into some paper, and when I mean by a paper I mean the constitution or some law, that doesn't mean necessarily that you're actually exercising them, and that there's a huge leap between what is written in a constitution and what actually happens in reality. So all of these things need to be there in order to actually get people out of poverty. So we transition into this idea of why are countries poor. Well, there are different explanations of why countries are poor, and let's talk about two of them. The first of them is essentially this idea that countries are poor because they lack sufficient natural resources that they can use to basically invest in the different types of activities that will allow them to generate wealth, and with that wealth escape poverty. And this happens in many places in the world, and has happened in many places, or many periods of time throughout history. So people like Jeffrey Sachs essentially call this poverty traps, in the sense that certain countries know what they need to do. Certain countries know that if they invested in this type of stuff, or this, they improve their education, or they improve something, they could slowly but surely start going out of poverty. But they don't have the resources to do them. Therefore, Jeffrey Sachs has proposed this idea about, well, let's help them out. Others, more developed countries or international institutions like the World Bank or the IMF, or others like multinational institutions, should be human enough and try to give some resources to these poorer countries, such that they can have a little bit of help, and with those resources invest them in key areas. And that's a little bit what they propose in terms of foreign aid. Then you have the opposite side of the spectrum, in which there are others who believe that countries are not necessarily poor just because of poverty traps, and that essentially you don't have too many poverty traps, but that what you don't have is the alignment of incentives of the different people or factions of society, whether they are firms, in general consumers, the government, or different ethnicity groups, different groups in general society are not in alignment of what are the policies and what are the things that you need to do in order to develop, in order to grow, in order to in general just fight poverty. And that because they don't have the appropriate market structure, no one can actually invest there, and it's really hard to move from there because you have barriers to entry. If you remember your microeconomics courses, barriers to entry signal something that you can have new players, new entrepreneurs into a specific market, because there are other incumbent firms, existing firms or players in that market, that prevent, through some legal mechanism, through extortion, through different ways, for new players to participate and bring fresh ideas and bring in general things. And this could happen not only in the market side of things. This happens all the time in the political side of things. See how hard it is in Mexico, for example, to bring or create new parties. There are other countries in which they have much broader democracies in the sense that they have many, many different parties, and new ones are born, others die. And even though currently the governing party is a technically a very new party in the sense that it was created 6 years ago, in general, it has been hard to actually move from like the typical traditional parties, not only in Mexico, but in many places. And citizens tend to have the door closed in many areas in which they could participate and improve things. So that makes it hard. And essentially, people like William Easterly and Dambasa Moyo suggest that, well, foreign aid only worsens this thing, because what happens, and what happened, especially in the Cold War, was that, well, the US and the USSR decided to give aid or resources to specific countries because they were capitalist or because they were communist, even if they were the most brutal and inefficient governments, even if they were thugs and killers. They didn't care. They just wanted to basically prevent the red wave or prevent the spread of capitalism, depending on which point of view they had. And they would basically finance a bunch of governments in Africa and in Latin America that essentially were not very good, to say the least. And that affected a lot the development of those countries, and that they had bloody civil wars or armed conflicts. And they were facilitated because those authoritarian governments received money from these specific big powers, and they essentially just were not funneled or channeled towards the appropriate things. So foreign aid is a tricky subject. But in reality, there are poverty traps. Foreign aid actually can be detrimental, but still, the main idea that Jeffrey Sachs proposes is true. Like, we have seen poverty traps in a lot of ways and in a lot of moments in time. And probably you can think of a lot of examples right now from things back home here in Mexico, or from other places. But in general, as you were discussing previously, in the things that make countries poor or that make people poor, well, we have different things. And I'm just proposing a couple of examples. They are not comprehensive. There are more than this, but these are a couple to show things that affect how you can develop as a person, and in general also as a country. So you have a bunch of things. The lack of access to education, clearly one that is really important. The lack of access to a nutritious diet and overall in general health, having or being able to basically eat correctly and like don't get sick, or your illnesses can be treated. Those type of things affect a lot the people that are poor. The access to technology can leave behind certain people. Think of how right now, in this current day of age, with the COVID-19 pandemic, public education in Mexico will be televised. And it will be televised because 94% of the country has a television, and they will be in the public free channels, right? But this is by no means an ideal solution. This happens because there are too many people that don't have access to internet in Mexico. So right now we have around 80 million people with access to internet in the country, but 95% of them have access through a cell phone, probably a smartphone. But when you discount the idea of the smartphone and you just focus on the people that have a computer with access to internet, you're down to like only 30 something million out of the 128 million Mexicans. So when you're talking about only like 30% of the country, 25% of the country has actually access to the internet, it's really hard to receive an education when you're not at your school. And that is disproportionately affecting the poorest people. Beyond the pandemic, if you think, for example, of what has happened too many times in the southern part of Mexico, in particular Oaxaca, the CENTE, the first dissident teachers union from the original CENTE, has had a long battle with the previous administrations regarding how education is handled in Oaxaca and other places near Oaxaca. And beyond who is correct or who is incorrect, what is completely a fact is that education levels in Oaxaca are several levels behind education levels in other parts of the country. And when you see why it's really hard to invest in the southern states, think of like big factories from multinational firms that will export from there or through some port towards the United States. One of the key elements that hinders investment there is that the workers you can hire don't have the necessary abilities or skills, and that is a long-term process. And the CENTE has not been a good player there in that sense, because it is hindering the ability of students to have access to education when they don't have classes too many days of the year. When you have that suddenly they were not, Oaxacan children were not receiving classes 2 3 months of the year. It's really hard to keep up in that way. When you see other countries and you see how the different socioeconomic statuses affect how people take information, you see that richer kids can have different summer activities, whether that is a summer camp or whether that is like afternoon activities in which they can be learning different things. And the people from poorer neighborhoods don't have access to that type of stuff. So even if they go to the same elementary school, by the end of the fourth or fifth year, the development gap between the richer kids and the poorer kids is not trivial. And it can be explained by different factors, but one of them is that others are receiving more education. In general, they're receiving better education through better education opportunities that come with more resources. That is one of the things.